Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Night Watchman Society's event on why economics can't explain the modern world with Professor Deirdre McCloskey. Before we begin, I'd like to just tell you a little bit about the Night Watchman Society. We are essentially a meetup group that discusses a wide range of economic and socio-political topics through a classical liberal lens. We host a monthly meeting, which alternates between a public discussion, like today's event, and a book club, where we explore critical ideas related to individual freedom and an open society. We also function as the Bastiat Society Chapter in Sri Lanka. Now, without much ado, let's get into the event. Moderating the discussion today will be Dean Jaimana. Over to you, Dean.
Hello, everyone. So let me just start off by giving a very warm welcome to Professor McCloskey. We're very honored to have you. Professor McCloskey is a globally renowned economist and an economic historian. The format for today of this evening is rather simple. In a few moments, I'm going to invite Professor McCloskey to speak for about 30 minutes. Then I will start off with some questions, and we will then open up for the questions from the audience. We plan to run this for about an hour. I acknowledge that there's a match on, so we'll try and wrap that up. But if there are questions, we can sort of extend that a little bit further. If you have any questions, please put them on as we go along in the Q&A box if you're joining us from Zoom. If you are in one of the live streams, please put them in the comments and somebody will get them to me. We will also allow audio questions once the talk is finished. So let me give a small introduction to Professor McCloskey. Deirdre McCloskey is the Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Economics, History, English, and Communication at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She was trained in the 1960s as an economist at Harvard, where she received her PhD. She taught for about 12 years at the University of Chicago in the economics department in its glory days, so to speak. She has a further 11 honorary degrees from various universities in the US and Europe. A prolific writer, Professor McCloskey has written over 25 books and some 400 academic articles, covering anything from economic theory, political theory, economic history, philosophy, rhetoric, statistical theory, feminism, ethics, and law. She's clearly what you would call a polymath in every sense of the word. Her most recent popular books include Bettering Humanomics, a new and old approach to economic science, Why Liberalism Works, How True Liberal Values Produce a Freer, More Equal, Prosperous Society, World for All, at Yale University Press, and also Leave Me Alone and I'll Make You Rich, the Bourgeois Deal from the University of Chicago Press. The reason for our invitation today is that as part of our Night Watchman Society, we host a bi-monthly book club. And one of her books called The Bourgeois Dignity was chosen to be read. And I had the honor of inviting Professor McCloskey to speak to us before we actually discuss her book. So that is the result of that. This Bourgeois Dignity book is part of a kind of a trilogy of books on similar topics. The first book in this series is called Bourgeois Virtues, Ethics for an Age of Commerce. And the final one, the third one in that series is called Bourgeois Equality, How Ideas, Not Modern Capital or Institutions, Made the Modern World Possible. Professor McCloskey describes herself as a, let me get this right, literary, quantitative, postmodern, free market, progressive, Episcopalian, ex-Marxist, Midwestern woman from Boston who was once a man. She says she's not a conservative, but she's a Christian, classical liberal. Professor McCloskey, thank you so much for joining us and accepting our invitation. And over to you. Thank you.
I'm glad to be in Sri Lanka, even if only virtually. I look forward to going there, especially in the cricket season. I'm a avid cricket fan. I have a speech defect, which I hope you'll allow for. So the question is how we got so rich. Now, I'm sure you think you aren't. Sri Lanka is growing, but still you're not as rich as the United States or Japan or something. But in fact, Sri Lanka is much better off than it was in, say, 1800 or 1900. And that's true quite generally in the world. It's not only the West, as we call it, that has experienced enormously large economic growth, but now we see in a place like Hong Kong in the 1950s and 60s to begin with, and Ireland, the home of my ancestors in the 1970s, especially 80s and 90s, and then China itself, so what we used to call Red China, and now India and Sri Lanka. Bangladesh is doing very well. When I was a student back in the 1960s, all these countries were thought to be hopeless. When I first visited Ireland, 1967, as a research student, it was a third world country, extremely poor, not as poor as Sri Lanka was, but very poor. And now it's this amazes me, this fact. It's the fourth of the substantial countries. I'm accepting little small countries, but of the substantial countries, though much smaller than Sri Lanka in population, Ireland is the fourth, has the fourth highest income per head in the world. And it's open to Sri Lanka to have the same. There's no racial or religious or I don't know, geographical reason that Sri Lanka shouldn't follow Hong Kong and Singapore and Taiwan into great prosperity. Now, the usual way that economics looks at economic growth is, I think, deeply erroneous, deeply mistaken. And this mistake, I think, applies to both the left and the right of conventional politics. On the left, the idea is that we in, say, France or I don't know, Spain are rich because of colonialism, or Britain is rich because the bosses exploited the working class, or the West in general is rich because it exploits what we once called the third world. Now, the exploitation argument is very, very weak. I understand that colonialism was not nice and that it was hurtful and in a way continues to be, as it were, emotionally hurtful to those colonized. But that something hurts, I don't know, Jones, doesn't mean that Smith, who's the instrument of the hurt, is better off. If I take a gun, very easy to get in my own country, and I go to the local grocery store and hold it up, and in the course of this robbery, accidentally kill the clerk. That was my intention, but I did. The clerk and the store are really very badly off. They're hurt by it. But I get what, $37 or something from the robbery. So my benefit from imperialism, which of course is my point, is not the same as the hurt from imperialism. So the imperial argument is weak, and the internal exploitation argument is even weaker, because the argument is, and the hero of my youth, Marx, was the originator of this. The internal exploitation theory is that the bosses, this small group of the owners of the factories and so on, they steal surplus value from the workers. Then they reinvest the surplus value, otherwise known as profit, and they become rich, and the workers become poorer and poorer. But wait a minute, we're trying to explain economic growth. We're trying to explain why the average person in Sri Lanka or Britain is vastly better off than she was in 1800. In 1800, in the world, on average, with only exceptions of a few lords and priests, the average person earned $2 or $3 a day. That's in modern prices. And at $2 or $3 a day, my ancestors and yours were utterly poor. They couldn't read. They died before they were 30, and so forth. But now, even in Sri Lanka, the income is much, much higher. In a place like Japan or Sweden, the income in 1800 was about $2 or $3 a day, and now it's well over $100 a day. So it's that much of an increase. Now, how, I ask you, just arithmetically, on this internal exploitation theory, does the theft by one group of the society, called the bosses, from the other side, from the other part of the society, manage to make the bosses richer and the rest of the society poorer, if you're trying to explain an increase by a factor of 30 or 40 or 50 in the average income per head? It doesn't make sense. The great Marxist economist at Cambridge University, Joan Robinson, of an earlier generation, pointed this out a long time ago. She said it can't be the case both that the bosses are made vastly better off, the poor are made poorer, and yet on average, wait a second, the average person and the average poor person is much better off. So there's something deeply mistaken about the exploitation argument. Now, on the other side of the standard political spectrum, left to right, the conservatives say, well, it's the virtuous behavior. Again, they like the rich people, so they say it's the virtuous behavior of the rich people in saving that makes for modern economic growth. If you accumulate capital, which, by the way, is also part of the theory on the left, then you get higher and higher economic growth. The society as a whole gets better off. If you make more roads, more hotels, more factories, more improved land, more plantations for tea and so forth, the average person gets better off. Now, in a way, that's true, in the sense that if you look around at a rich society, I'm looking now out my window, and there's a great big apartment building across the street, 13 or 14 stories tall. And if the people who live in that building had to go live in tents, they would be much worse off than they are when they have a nice apartment in Chicago. But wait a minute. Capital by itself doesn't cause anything. And this is true of physical capital, like the apartment building that I'm speaking of, but it also applies to human capital. If you get a university degree, or you learn a skill, or you're strong, have a strong back and skilled hands, that's useless. None of those are of any use unless there's a human idea of how to use them in a productive way. Pouring capital into an economy, which used to be the theory of the World Bank of how to achieve modern economic growth, doesn't accomplish anything if it's not accompanied by innovative ideas. Now, there are two ways of proving this. One, I'm a historian, but I'm also an economist. The historical way to show that sheer capital accumulation, saving, and then capital can't be the explanation of why we're so rich, and why in the next 50 years, Sri Lanka will have the same income per head as Europe, if you play your cards right. It is the historical one that, after all, saving is a human habit. In archaeological sites in Sri Lanka and elsewhere, you find so-called Aushulian axes made out of flint or other sharpened stone. And you find them by the hundreds. They're called hand axes, but they weren't actually axes. They were things you could throw at wild animals, or cut through their skin, their hide once you had killed them for meat. You could use them to break bones and get to the marrow and eat that. Anyway, for 1.5 million years, it was a human technology, and it involved accumulation. I said scores and hundreds of these things are found in archaeological sites. And after all, in China, the Grand Canal was the longest canal in the world for many years. Improved acreage, paddy fields and so forth are commonplace in East and South Asia, and they involve tremendous investment. So if investment, that is capital accumulation by itself, were enough to cause modern economic growth, it would have happened in China or ancient India or all over the place. So there's something strange about that, something historically wrong about that argument. And the economic argument against accumulation as the solution to the problem of why we're so rich and why in the next 50 or perhaps 100 years, the whole world is going to become rich, is that sheer capital accumulation, because capital accumulation by just having another apartment building across the street and another, I mean, on this very site, another and another and another, experiences diminishing returns. It's perfectly obvious. You have a bicycle, a scooter, a car, automobile. Suppose you had another one and another and another. It's clear that the fifth vehicle would be of little use to you. It's marginal product, if you use it for making things or providing services, would be very low. You had a spare car in your front yard, it's not doing you any good at all. So without an idea of how to use these things, and not just these things that we make, but the natural environment or other ideas, without new ideas of how to do things, we can't raise our game. If you want to raise your game in cricket, you figure out how to be a better spin bowler, like that amazing Sri Lankan spin bowler who got how many, 4 or 5 wickets in a single over. I saw it from South Africa on TV. So to raise your game, you need innovation. And that's the solution. That's the explanation for how in the last 2 centuries, we've gone from $2 or $3 a day in the world, the whole world now, to about, on average, $45 a day. Now, this isn't, I understand, this isn't about inflation or something. This is real growth. So now to sort of fix ideas, the average person on the planet earns about what they earn in Brazil, or indeed China. China has caught up to Brazil. Now China is about 20% of the entire world's population. And so that's quite an important improvement in equality. It is often said that we have a terrible problem of inequality in the modern world. And I would say it's more or less the opposite, that because China and now South Asia are growing fast, that's 40% of the entire world's population is either in China or in South Asia. You can't get more world inequality if the poorest people in the world, who once were in South Asia and East Asia, are now getting much better off at a rate much faster than in the old, so-called old. I mean, you're older than I am, so to speak. I mean, in these old these places that have been rich for a long time. So it's ideas. It's ideas in a creative society that make people rich. Now, the idea doesn't have to be fancy. It doesn't have to be a new method of propulsion of jet planes or something, or a new vaccine for COVID. It can be the simple idea of starting a new hairdressing salon in the neighborhood. That's raising the game of the neighborhood, making it better off by having a hairdressing salon that it lacks. That's the point. If there's an opportunity, an entrepreneurial opportunity that you see and other people don't, that's a creative act. Now, of course, you may be wrong, in which case your hair salon, your new hair salon, will not succeed because it'll be tested in commerce and found to be not a good idea. But at least in that case, your capital goes to someone else, and they can try to have a new idea. So it's these new ideas, and it's very easy to name them. I mean, there are thousands and millions of these new ideas since 1800. Now, wait a second. Let's go back to the historical perspective. Humans have always innovated. Some smart African, back when we were all Africans, before about 70,000 BCE, invented the bow and arrow. You know, she or he noticed that with a kind of flexible stick and a piece of twine, you could throw a little spear at game, at an antelope, or indeed at a person. And that was a very significant invention. Some smart person in Southwest Central Asia, above the Black Sea, figured out how to ride a horse. We had been eating horses for a long time. We Homo sapiens, we'd been dining on them for quite a while. And then some smart person said, oh, let's see, maybe I can ride on this thing. And so we've always innovated. You know, the windmill, the invention, so to speak, or the innovation of growing tea in Sri Lanka. Those are all advances. Those all raised the game. But they were too slow before 1800. They were too slow to offset the Malthusian pressures of the greater population that the initial prosperity brought. More children, more mouths, less food per mouth. But the great change since 1800, almost since Parson Malthus first articulated this idea of Malthusian pressures in 1798, almost from the date of the publication of his book, it became less and less relevant. And the reason it did is that the idea production enormously increased worldwide. Now, I'm going to end with the following assertion, which I've tried to document in my books and articles. It is that the ideas came from liberalism. The ideas came from the theoretical idea, the idea from advanced intellectuals in Northwestern Europe. It is highly confined in the 18th century. Voltaire and John Locke and Mary Wollstonecraft and so forth said an ideal society would be one in which hierarchies, castes, for example, to speak in South Asian terms, are eliminated, and in which everyone has equal, now hear the word, permission. Not equal opportunity, as we often say, and certainly not equal outcomes, but equal permission, and are allowed to trade with each other completely freely, and are allowed to try out new ideas. They have free speech, free assembly, free press, free, out of which came, I claim, and try to show in my books, the innovations, the particular innovations, the railway, electricity, opening the hair salon, whatever it is, that made us rich. So in short, and here I'll stop, we're rich because we were liberated from hierarchies. The hierarchy of master and slave, the hierarchy of husband and wife, the hierarchy of imperial power and colony, the hierarchy of old people over young people, all the hierarchies that are characteristic, especially of agricultural societies. Hunter-gatherer societies are much more egalitarian, but hunter-gatherer societies, the power of a man with a sword on a horse over your ancestors and mine, was by this theory slowly implemented. Slowly, people were freed. And I could go through the list, starting with poor men in Britain in, say, 1832, comparatively poor men, to the abolition movement of slavery, the women's movement, decolonization, the gay rights movement, one after another. More freedom was permitted, and the result was enrichment. Now, one more point. As I said, as I was introduced as a Christian liberal, and that's right. If this enrichment had caused us to lose our souls, our immortal souls, if we had become corrupted by the enrichment, I would be against it. But we weren't. I think, although there's a long tradition in South Asia and in Abrahamic faiths of saying that poor people are spiritually superior to rich, I don't think that's true. I don't think our enrichment has cost us the quality of our souls. So we're rich, and on our way to being rich, and the way to achieve it is liberty. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Deirdre. So we're getting a couple of questions in, but so you can also ask questions by raising your hand, and then I can sort of give you access to ask questions on in audio. So we already have 2 people, but let me start off by asking a question of my own. So in the book and more generally, you sort of in the Bourgeois Dignity, that the one that we're reading for the book club, you kind of go through the litany of theories about why this, how this great enrichment, or rather that supposed to explain this great enrichment, and you find them sort of wanting. So you go through colonialism, and you go through institution theory, you go through a few others like that. Let me sort of dig through a bit more about the colonial argument, because this is something that everybody sort of throws at, especially in this part of the world, about that, ideas, that's great. But really what you guys did was that you came to what was the rich part of the world, in India and so on, and you basically robbed all of the wealth.
Yeah.
Source of your wealth is essentially something that was robbed from our part of the world.
That's
how would you touched on that a little bit, but how would you kind of, how much of that wealth really, wealth in Europe really is explained by the colonial?
Well, let's go back to the 18th century, the 1700s, and speak of Clive of India. The man who stole became extremely rich in Britain by stealing from South Asia. Okay. If you go back and calculate his wealth, which was large by 18th century standards, it's an extremely small percentage of the total wealth of Britain. So there's something very strange in arguing that a little small amount of additional wealth in Britain could have caused an expansion by a factor of 20, 30, 40 in average income per head in the country. There's a very similar argument that is still actively going on about the slave trade as the source of what Marx called the original accumulation of capital. As I explained, the theory that capital is the source is itself very hard to agree with. But Marx said, well, the original accumulation came from the slave trade. Actually, he said piracy, but also the slave trade. And this has been actively considered now for 80 years in scholarship. And again, the problem is that the profits of the slave trade were, for one thing, for various reasons, small and not achieved mainly in Europe. But in any case, what were achieved in Europe, say Britain, were too small to explain much. And in any case, as I'll say it for the third time, accumulation is not what made us rich. New ideas made us rich. Now, remember my example that imperialism could have hurt people a lot more than it benefited the imperial power. It's just not the case that if I take out a gun and shoot you, that makes me better off. So stealing is not what made the world rich.
Thanks. So we have a couple of raised hands. So I'm going to give to Aponso to start off with. So I have given you access, Aponso, so you can ask your question.
Hi, Professor. Thank you very much for the presentation. My question is quite simple, I would say. The historical argument of economics, as I see, is a little out of context in the present scenario. Historically, industrialization has moved in a certain manner, but what is driving now is quite a different dynamics, and that requires a different way of looking at the market. I agree with you. Market is a liberalizer which enables, at least in some kind of context, it provides people the opportunity. But the question now is it really the case now? Does the market function now? And the ones who have got powerful, do they allow the other guys to get into the market in a fair manner? This is the question that we have at the moment within a country and globally as well. Thank you.
Yeah, and well, I understand this concern and the argument that what happened in the past is not the same as what's happening now. I understand it, but I don't agree with it. I think we're seeing, as I think we all agree, a new globalization. We had one in the late 19th century, and then after the Europeans got into their horrible quarrel in August of 1914, around the world, we closed down the global economy. But for the last half century or so, it's been opening up. We've got much freer trade. There's much freer movement of capital, especially, and to some degree, although not as much as there ought to be, free movement of people. But this very fact means that a single country can't oppress its working class as it could when economies were closed. And even within a country, if you don't have central planning or in industrial policy, which is a kind of soft version of central planning, if you allow people to try out things, it's still true that people can make their fortune, a small fortune or a large fortune. I mean, let's take the Amazon, for example, this amazing marketing innovation by Jeff Bezos. in the United States? Well, all he was doing is reinventing the mail order companies of 100 years ago, now in the age of the internet. In Sri Lanka, you're very innovative in the use of the internet and computers. And there are opportunities, there continue to be opportunities for raising the game. So there's a claim that there's a rising monopoly over the last 2 centuries. And I would say that it's the opposite, that improved methods of transportation, reduced transactions costs have slowly caused the role of monopoly in the economy to decline. I have a paper on this that talks about these many imperfections that we teach our students in economics, which in my paper I claim that, look, one of these imperfections is supposed to be that the big people, the monopolists, can oppress everyone else, and it's not so.
All right, thank you. Does that, you have a follow-up, Pons?
Yep. Can I, please?
Yep.
I would sort of put that question this way. I think you're absolutely right. Internet has an equalizer, which has given the market a new dimension in the globalized system. But at the same time, historically, if you just look at it, the kind of tussle that we have seen between Japan and the US, and now it is manifested between China and the US, under whatever the circumstances, it's not only the companies, even the governments are in the whole equation and throwing their powers around to not to facilitate the market, but rather to monopolize. So the monopolization is not just the corporations, it's going across governments as well. So in that respect, I think there's even the large corporations are working with the governments rather than working as independent bodies.
I understand that.
Fair ground. That's not happening.
I understand that, dear, and I don't think your examples prove the case. And let's take the case of Japan. In the 1980s, we in the West, let's call it, were talked constantly about the threat from Japan. Well, how did that work out? Japan, which, as you say, had a lot of involvement of the government in industry and industry in government, didn't prove to be the great threat that it was claimed to be. They gave us Toyotas and we gave them soybeans, and that was about it. Now the talk is all about the danger of China. Now, I think there is a military danger from China. I think they say, and they say it openly, that they're contemplating invading Taiwan. And they've had wars with India over and over again. All right, so there's a military danger. But the economic danger is greatly exaggerated. For example, the Chinese build railways in Kenya. And you think, oh my God, the Chinese are taking over Africa. Oh no, wow, how terrifying. If the Kenyans want to take the railway back, they can do it tomorrow. And the Chinese will be able to do nothing about it. In the 19th century, the West could send gunboats to China to enforce unequal treaties, to protect their Western investments. China can't do it now. It's just impossible. What they're gonna bomb Kenya? This so-called economic power is not real power. It's the opportunity to trade. And so this idea that the Chinese are taking over the world is a military possibility, but not an economic possibility.
All right, thank you. So let's go into some more questions, and let's stay on the China theme. Somebody's asking, Tarini is asking. You mentioned that it was a liberal sort of order that that unlocked this great enrichment, so to speak. And she's asking, how do you explain China's unbelievable growth to get
Well, it's
800
easy.
million people
It's
out
easy.
of poverty? Because it wasn't, I mean, her question is, it's not liberalism. I mean, they were essentially communists.
Yes, it is. Now, of course, in politics, to put it mildly, it was not and continues to be strikingly illiberal. As we all know, all political offices are held by members of the Chinese Communist Party, from the top to the bottom. So I agree. In politics, in free speech, in a free press, in a functioning, fair court system, such as you basically have in Sri Lanka, you have all of those things. China does not. But the reason China developed after 1978 in this extraordinary way, going from $1 or $2 a day, as I said, to $45 a day, was liberalism in the economy. So there's no such thing as the Chinese model. That's a mistake. The Chinese model that, alas, Xi Jinping is in the process of reestablishing, the Maoist model, and indeed the model of central 5-year planning in South Asia until 1991 in India, was a disaster. Chinese income per head was stagnant for 3 or 4 decades, while, say, in Hong Kong, where without any political rights, so not liberal in the political sense in Hong Kong, but the same as in Singapore, the economy was liberalized. So here's what I'm saying to it. The only model that works economically is the liberal model in the economy. Now, I have doubts that, it's a question whether a liberal economy leads to other kinds of freedoms. But in any case, so far as economic prosperity is concerned, the only model is not central planning, not industrial planning, not the smart people in Washington or London making decisions about the economy, but leaving people alone.
All right, thank you. Ravi, do you still have a question? You had your hand up.
Yeah, okay, I'll ask for it. The Industrial Revolution was the product of ideas, not just advances in science, but also in the application of science
Yes.
to solve practical problems. Now, these in turn, I believe, preceded by the Enlightenment, which came through the Republic of Letters. Is this the case, and what were the most important ideas that came about of from this process?
Well, the argument that you just made or outlined is that of my dear friend Joel Mokyr, the great economic historian. And Joel and I agree on a great deal. We agree that ideas matter. And in that way, we're not agreeing with most of our economist colleagues. But Joel puts much more emphasis on science, high science, than I would. The applications of actual science to the economy, I would argue, and he and I have argued this out for a long time, didn't have much of an effect on the economy of the world until around 1900. After 1900, more and more science, high science matters. I mean, the very medium that you and I are speaking on is surely an example of the application of very sophisticated science of one sort or another. But that was well after the great enrichment had gone quite far and had advanced quite a lot. Most of the advancement, even nowadays, I would say, most of the advancement is not high applied science. My favorite example is behind me. Right here is a reinforced concrete pillar in my house that holds up the 13 floors of the building here in Chicago. Reinforced concrete takes an ancient technology applied in South Asia and India, Rome, et cetera, namely cement, and inserts the newly cheap steel in the middle of the 19th century. That was a new invention. Steel could be made and had been made in small amounts for a long, long time. But then it got extremely cheap in large amounts. So you put steel in concrete and you get reinforced concrete, which allows you to build skyscrapers. Well, that had nothing to do with science. And to just give one more example, the main achievement of high science in the 17th and 18th century was celestial mechanics, understanding the movements of the planets. Now, the only time that got applied was when we started sending rockets into outer space. And that was a long time after the great enrichment had taken hold.
Thank you. Ravi, is that okay?
Well, I don't expect to persuade anyone in, a few minutes of argument. This is a complicated argument, and Joel and I have been at it for a long time. But I've simply outlined the basic contours of our disagreement.
So, Asantha, do you want to talk?
There's a lot of argument here about wealth. I mean, absolute wealth. But even if you look at some of the Western countries where you say people are rich, it's not necessarily that they have a whole lot of savings or anything like that, but their living standards are higher. Can you explain a little bit about that? You said capital is not really important, but I mean, they seem to be having high living standards and they seem to be consuming more things. How has it differed from the time? And even I see even in Sri Lanka, people are consuming more things in very many ways.
I'm not completely clear, but if you're asking about inequality, I have a lot to point out about that. In the first place, as I said during my talk, globally, it seems to me obvious that inequality in the last 40 or 50 years has declined, personal inequality. The average person in China, who was unspeakably poor 40 or 50 years ago, is now not so badly off. And that means that the bottom in South Asia and East Asia has been raised. Now, inside countries, we have to deal with the kind of arguments that the French economist Piketty makes. I have a long review of his first book available on my website. And it's a honorable, serious job that he did, but it's wrong. And it's wrong in all kinds of ways. For example, you'll see a lot of discussion about financial wealth, as though financial wealth was all you needed to examine to understand inequalities of wealth. But most income in the modern world is generated by human capital. And in his book, he stops every once in a while to say, well, I haven't included human skills or education in capital. And well, I don't know, I don't think it's capital, which is silly. Of course it's capital. It's earning potential. That's what land and capital is. If you own an acre of land, you can grow stuff on it. It has earning potential. If you have a higher education, it's got earning potential. So immediately, he's grossly mismeasured capital to start with. He ignores also social capital. So, I could go on and on. I could spend the next hour going through his book and showing you why it doesn't work. But the basic argument why it doesn't work is that if there are not increasing monopolies that protect the rich from competition, the gains from innovation go to us, the consumers. The Nobel economist Bill Nordhaus calculates that since the Second World War in the United States, 98% of the social value, social gain of innovation has gone to ordinary people. Only 2% has gone to people like the family of Walton, the father of Walmart. That makes the Walmarts very rich, but it's only 2%, and the 98% goes to us. So as long as they're not massive government planned obstacles to entry is the key to all this. At the smell of profit, the benefit goes to ordinary people. How do I know that? Just in a gross way, because income per head in the world is growing at about 2% a year and has been for half a century, and there's no reason for it to not continue. At 2% a year, by the end of the century, Sri Lankan income will be 8 times what it is now. And in fact, Sri Lanka is growing faster than 2% a year in real terms.
Thank you. Dileepa, do you have a question?
Yes. Thank you for the opportunity. My question was like the way I understood the idea that the liberal values equal permissions and the primacy of innovation on wealth creation, it makes perfect sense. And I was wondering, since you also have a background in history, whether you could explain the drivers behind the growth of nationalism that we see in recent decades throughout the world, which is somewhat worrying for a liberal. I mean, we see it in USA, China, Europe, India, as well as in Sri Lanka. And I was wondering, like, does alienation has a role in this regard, and what leads to this global bickering or tendency to do that? Thank
Well,
you.
it's a grave concern of you and me. I mean, if Donald Trump gets reelected in 2024, we're in for really serious global problems that he will create, and the encouragement to that kind of behavior will create. If Modi in India continues to exploit nationalism and Hindu nationalism in particular, that's a bad way to go. If Xi Jinping in China continues his nationalist campaign, we're in for problems of a military sort, not necessarily of an economic sort. So yeah, I'm extremely concerned. Here's how I view it over the last 3 centuries. Whoops, hold on. Can I answer this phone? I have to. It'll only take a second. Hello. Yes.
Professor, I muted you, so you might want to unmute.
Problem with my email, which I have to solve today, or I won't be able to send emails. But anyway, the 3 big ideas that people have had about how we should run our lives in the last 3 centuries have been liberalism in the 18th century, nationalism in the early 19th century, and socialism in the middle of the 19th century. And those 3 ideas of intellectuals have dominated the world of the 20th and the 21st centuries in their action. And the first one is a good idea, that we have no more slaves, no more adults treated like children. That was a really good idea. The other 2, nationalism and socialism, have been disasters. And as you say, who knows how it's going to work out? If you like nationalism and socialism, maybe you'll like national socialism, such as the Germans tried out in 1933. So, we have to argue for freedom.
Thank you, Professor. I was wondering, now it's not only limited to what you say, and I'm afraid the way we see from outside, there's a real good chance of return of the empire back in 2024, the way things are going. And it's not only that,
well,
I think
I'm not just hopeful.
Mhm.
I think actually it's unlikely that he'll win. Look, I think in all countries, in Sri Lanka, in the United States, in France, and everywhere, about 20% of the people are naturally fascists. They're naturally extreme nationalists. But that's only 20%. And so then that person, whoever it is in charge of the 20%, has to convince 30% of the population more to vote for him or her. And so I don't think he's going to succeed this time. For one thing, Donald Trump may end up in jail in the next couple of years because he's a criminal. So let's hope he ends. We say in the United States that he ends up in an orange jumpsuit.
I was just
with
trying
shackles
to,
and
yeah. I was trying to acquire more theoretical understanding as to what gives rise to this thing. Like,
Well,
whether is it, if at all, do we only have the ideological weapons to, fight and make our
yeah,
case, or
yeah,
how
I
can
understand.
we? Yeah,
Well, I understand it. And in the third book of the trilogy called Bourgeois Equality, I try to explain why liberalism arose in Northwestern Europe among intellectuals and then in practice in the 18th and then 19th centuries. But I'm much less competent to tell you why nationalism rose, except that in its early form, it was a form of liberalism. Anti-colonialism is a form of liberalism in its origin. But unfortunately, in places like India, it got associated, and China for that matter, it got associated with the other ideas, socialism. And the result was unhappy in both India and in China until the last 30 or 40 years. But it's above my pay grade, as we say in the United States, to explain all these political movements. But I agree with you in being frightened by them.
Yeah, thank you, Bryce, and thanks, Dilita. So let me just do a kind of a follow-up based on the Q&A box. So you spoke about sorry, I unmuted you. I thought you might get a call. You might have to unmute you.
There, now I'm okay again. I apologize for this.
No worries. So we have about 15 minutes, so we'll try to wrap up then. I think we asked for Professor's minute for about 90 minutes, and we're kind of coming close to that. But let me ask something from the question box. You mentioned about kind of liberalism being the heart of this great enrichment. So Mr. Chandra Jayaratna from the Q&A is asking that liberalism has brought material wealth, but it has also created extreme stress in the environment, affecting human well-being globally.
Yeah.
He's asking, are we at the tipping point right now? Doesn't it negate the very concept of liberal economic growth, the environmental stress?
I of course I don't think so, but it's not just a dogmatic opinion on my part. I'm not just saying, oh no, you're wrong. Let's think about something else. I'm optimistic about the possibilities of enrichment to cure environmental problems. Now, again, as a historian, I think the past is a guide. And for example, air pollution in London was appalling before the various Clean Air Acts after the war, after the Second World War. I remember when I lived in England as a teenager, 1959, one night I went out to go to the coffee shop in Camberley in Surrey. And I went out the door and I couldn't see my feet. So bad was the smog, the so-called pea soup. Fog, which wasn't just fog, it was also in air pollution from the burning of soft coal. And, you don't want to walk around when you can't see your feet. So I went back into the house and didn't go to the coffee shop. That doesn't happen in England anymore. It's been taken care of. The hole in the ozone layer, which is a very dangerous problem. If the hole kept growing, we'd all die of skin cancer because the ozone layer, you understand. Well, it was growing. And one of the causes, this is amusing, was hairspray. Now, there were other more important causes, but hairspray was one of the sources of the chemicals that was killing off the ozone layer. And the conservative Margaret Thatcher, by the way, a big user of hairspray, was one of the leaders in eliminating that element from hairspray and other industrial processes. And the ozone layer is now safe. I think that carbon capture is promising and might well happen. I think there are other things we can do. For example, we can do nuclear power. People start, oh no, nuclear power, that's terrible, it's bombs and everything. No, it's not. 85% or 90, I forget the exact figure, of French electricity is generated by clean nuclear power. So I think I don't think we're at a, well, you know, I'm not competent to say whether we're at a hopeless tipping point, but I do say that economic growth can provide us with the ideas to solve these environmental problems. Not all of them, but most of them.
Thank you. Deepali, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, thanks. So I wanted to ask you, you know, there's a lot of individuals around the world who have concentrated wealth in their hands, mainly from technocratic, ventures that they control. What role should the government have in such a situation? And what do you feel about this concentration of power in private hands?
I think there's a smaller amount of concentration of power in private hands than there ever has been in history. Now, I invite you to read that paper I mentioned on my website about this matter. It's got in its title, it says something like empty economic boxes. It's a somewhat strange title, I admit, but that's what it says, empty economic. So if you go look at that, you'll find that I've made the case that monopoly, that is the power in private hands, has declined in the last couple of centuries. But observe that now the great wealth, as you said, is from electronics, essentially. But in the past, it's been from manufacturing. United States Steel Company, founded in 1903 or 01, I forget which. And then about the same time, the great wealth from department stores. And earlier from that, the great wealth from local banks. And the great wealth sources keep being dissipated by entry. That's the key. If we have a free society in which people can start up new electronic-based enterprises, the monopoly profits, we call them rents in economics somewhat confusingly, will be distributed, as it were, to you and me. To take this example of Walmart again. Walmart in the United States has made retailing much cheaper than it was. So the old wealth from department stores has been overtaken by cheap goods coming out of Walmart. And it's happened over and over and over again. If you look at say, to take an American case, the Dow Jones Industrial Average, what companies are in it? It's 30 so-called industrial companies. And in 1930s, United States Steel was in it, and Google hadn't been invented. But now Google is in it. And is it Google? I think it is. Google is in it, and United States Steel barely exists anymore. General Motors was once a dominant automobile manufacturer in the United States. Then it essentially went bankrupt. So if we have a free society and government is not recruited to protect the rich people, then we haven't got anything to fear from them. On the contrary, the rich bosses give us goods. They'd like to have a monopoly, but they don't keep it.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Deepali. So in the last sort of 10 minutes or so that we have, let me kind of focus our discussion a bit more onto the original topic. I feel like we have discussed a whole lot of range of things, because you make certain like substantive claims in the book that even sort of classical liberals will sort of take another look at, right? So let's kind of look into some of the arguments that you make. So you say, essentially what happened in the Industrial Revolution is a revolution of ideas, that it was about the dignity that the bourgeois was allowed to have in order to do this kind of the equal permission part, and the innovation that brought in. So I have a couple of questions on that. So first, I mean, you run through some of these in your book. So let's kind of go back to the sort of even the original book, essentially, like the Adam Smith and the Pin Factory, right? So Smith argues that essentially it was the productivity gains through division of labor, and earlier the individual workers could produce so much pins, but you put them in a factory, you specialize, they learn more of that thing, and now suddenly they can do thrice, 4 times over. And that division of labor is essentially limited by the market. So you then expand the market, you have global free trade. That is really the source of the wealth of nations. So what is wrong with the great Smith and his explanation?
It's not entirely wrong. If tomorrow we were to close off, let's take the extreme, all trade. So you couldn't trade with your local baker to buy bread, and you couldn't, right? If we closed all trade in the world, obviously all of us would be impoverished. If I had to make my own computer, I wouldn't know how to do it. And all around me and all around all of us are the results of specialization. So in that sense, Adam Smith, I'm a Christian, so I always cross myself when Adam Smith's name is mentioned. But he was right. He's my hero. I love Adam Smith to that degree. But the problem is that historically, there's always been trade among humans. It's not as if trade, and even free trade, is new. It's not. True, when monopolists get hold of the government, as in cities in medieval Europe, they try to stop trade, or in a way that makes them the rich and other people poor. But no, that on the whole, they're not able to accomplish that. And humans have been trading since there have been humans. So it's not new. And so trade by itself is not an engine of growth, because of the one other mistake that Adam Smith made in his example of the pin factory. It's not just that one person gets to make the head of the pin and the other makes the shaft. It's that they invent new ways of making heads of pins and shafts of pins, and new ways of marketing pins, and new ways of organizing the fact. Those idea elements, as against specializing with given ideas, a given production function, is the main source of modern wealth. And this I argue in some detail in the book.
The other one is kind of competitiveness that is popular among sort of free market economists and so forth. And you have a kind of a scathing description of that kind of thinking. I mean, so the question is, I mean, can't it be the compounding effect of all of that, right? So you say that attributing growth to investment resembles attributing Shakespeare's plays to the Roman alphabet. The alphabet was necessary in a reduced sense, but was, of course, an assumed background, not the cause of any useful sense. Like, couldn't it be that, why was the ideas new, in the sense that what is the mechanics of acquiring those ideas? And didn't these ideas also then exist before the Industrial Revolution?
Well, that is all. I urge you to read the third volume, because in the third volume, I do to talk about in some detail where this new idea for a new liberal society came from, and argue in further detail about the consequences of that in the modern world in the last couple of centuries. But it's true that there's a puzzle here. Why didn't it happen earlier? Because the idea of ideas is not a new one. As I said, humans innovate. But if they're being crushed with a hierarchy of castes or something, if they're being crushed with imperialism, if they're being crushed with if they're being crushed with sexism, then they don't, I claim, flourish with new ideas, small ideas and large. So it's an empirical matter. It's a factual matter. These things can't be settled on a blackboard.
Thank you. So let me ask you the final question, and then let you go. You say that in the word capitalism itself is unfortunate, and that you prefer something like innovationism or something like that.
I call it innovism, which is easier to pronounce.
Right. Okay. So what do you think is wrong with the way that we kind of understand economics, understand capitalism, understand essentially this idea of economic growth, and how do you propose that we sort of think about it differently?
Well, I'm going to do a book. I've been thinking about it for a while. That sort of plays on a joke by an American humorist of a century and a half ago named Josh Billings. He said, "It ain't what you don't know that hurts you. It's what you know that ain't so, that isn't so." And there are a whole bunch of things that people think they know about the economy that are not so. And the big one is zero sum. That's the really big problem we have. Ordinary people without they're not bad people or they're not stupid people, but they start with this presumption of zero sum, that if I get rich, you must get poorer. And of course, before 1800, it was pretty much true. So it's not as if they're ignoring history. The only way that the lord of the manor got better off was by stealing from the peasants. So, okay, that's right. But it's not true of the modern world. It's not true since 1800. There, the modern world has been strikingly positive sum. As I said, going from, say, $2 a day to $45 a day is a heck of an improvement. And then to go on to $120 or $130 a day is really good. So that's one reason we get it wrong. The other reason we get it wrong, and this has to do with this capitalism versus innovism stuff, is that there's we all understand, it's not hard to understand, that there's a circular flow in the economy. It's a circular flow of the routine ways of doing things. To make tea or bread or ice cream, you combine certain ingredients and you buy those from suppliers, and you hire labor, and then the labor turns around and buys the ice cream, right? So it's a circular flow. And that you can understand, although some people don't. But anyway, you got that. But what I said before is true, that economic growth is raising the game. You can even think that Marx was correct, that there's surplus value extracted by the length of the workday and so on and so forth. Go through all that incorrect Marxist economics and think, well, okay, now I understand the circular flow, but still you haven't explained economic growth unless you believe falsely that sheer accumulation of capital without innovation causes us to raise our game. And it doesn't. You raise your game by raising your game. and trade or the division of labor or the circulation of capital or all the things that we think we understand ain't so as far as explaining economic growth is concerned.
All right. I think with that, we'll end today's discussion. Professor McCloskey, it's been a real honor and a pleasure to have you at the Night Watchman Society, and we hope to, maybe have you here in Sri Lanka in one of these days.
I'd love to come in the cricket season, dear, in the cricket season.
Absolutely. So we look forward to having you physically, maybe, and giving us a public talk one of these days when everything in the world is settled. So thank you so much for joining us, and thanks everyone. We are discussing Professor McCloskey's book this Friday, and everyone's welcome to join that. So if you're interested in attending that event, we will send you an email on the details, and you can kind of join us and have a discussion amongst ourselves.